Hello, and welcome to Sunday Night Shivers. Eerie fiction from Mark Leslie. This is Mark Leslie. We'll begin in just a moment. The music you're listening to is Gloom Horizon by Kevin MacLeod, and you can check out Kevin's great music at incompetech.com. Good evening. I'm going to stop the music now, and I'm going to read a story to you. My name is Mark Leslie. I'm a horror author. I write stories that are a little bit like Twilight Zone-ish in nature, and I'm going to read one of my favorites of mine called Browsers. Now, Browsers would be very similar to something you might see on The Outer Limits or The Twilight Zone. It appears in the short story collection, the mini collection, Active Reader, and other cautionary tales from the book world, and it's based on my very first trip to Hamilton, Ontario, when I actually got lost in a bookstore. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that after I finish the story. But first, I'm going to read the story, Browsers. Now, Browsers opens up with a quote, and the quote actually comes from this 1947 classic science fiction novel, Earth Abides by George R. Stewart. The stimulation of seeing so many books so suddenly seemed almost more than was good for the frail little boy. George R. Stewart, Earth Abides. Of course, I'm trying to figure out the overlay in the background and all of the banners and things like that, and I'm just going to remove this and put up the other banner. There we go. We're back to normal. Let me continue with the story, shall we? Stepping into a used bookshop is sometimes like stepping into another dimension. Where else but a used bookstore can one find such an eclectic selection of minds and experiences stored in dusty tomes just waiting to be browsed through by anyone who happens along? Occasionally, a used bookshop can be a painful experience, offering up nothing more than the latest trashy paperbacks and adult porn magazines. But sometimes a used bookstore can provide, to the avid browser, a mystical experience. Sometimes walking through that door, you are overwhelmed with a sense of awe, a sense that something powerful is being housed within the very walls. I discovered such a wondrous shop years ago on the corner of two streets whose names I cannot remember in one of those pseudo-cities on the southwestern edge of the Golden Horseshoe. Standing on the street, the sounds of traffic all around me, I beheld the quaint corner shop with curious eyes. The dark and dusty windows did not allow me a clear view of the interior of the shop, and, apart from the word Browsers painted on the window, there was no exterior sign indicating the name of the establishment. Trying to remember if I'd been to this particular shop before, I opened the door. The tiny bell overhead tinkled as I stepped inside. I had to pause as the familiar feeling of awe overtook me. Perhaps you feel it too when you walk into a used bookshop, the feeling that all eternity is poised, trapped in the moment, just waiting to spill forth into the future. Literature has always fascinated me. With writing, humankind has developed the ability to elevate a person to a state of immortality. And with that, anyone who reads can thus share in that immortal bliss. None of us have ever had the pleasure of meeting Shakespeare or Dickens personally, but they are still companions in our day-to-day travels. Though long dead, they are very much with us. That is the beauty and the power of literature. Perhaps that's why I've spent the last 3 decades of my life writing, trying to capture the spirit of myself on paper. To that point, I'd been unsuccessful, forced to live vicariously through the bold efforts of those great masters who'd come before me. That is probably why I would take such pleasure in browsing through a used bookshop. And occasionally, when feeling daring, I would fantasize about future generations browsing such a shop and finding one of my works, essentially discovering my spirit and keeping me alive. The absence of a book clerk was the first thing I noticed. But that wasn't unusual. He or she could be shelving books or helping another customer. Standing in the tiny entranceway, I glanced at the small podium desk, which I assumed the owner used as a workspace. My eyes then led forward to the next connected room, which was perhaps 8 by 12 feet. I moved into it. This room, crammed with the usual variety of books, led off directly to another room of similar size. Trying to get my bearings, I searched through the second room to find two more doorways to a third and fourth room. I took the door on the right and found from that room another three choices. The peculiarity struck me at that point. I paused and breathed in my amazement. What looked like such a tiny corner shop was actually a huge space divided into a multitude of rooms. I saw myself spending a lot of time here. I decided to waste no more time and began my browsing. I turned and scanned the books that filled the room I stood in. The shelves reached all the way up to the 9-foot ceiling of the room that I was in, and they were packed tightly with all sorts of books. Scanning the titles, I noticed that there was no particular order to them. There was an abundance of westerns and the occasional thriller shelved in this room, but apart from that, there was a plethora of every other imaginable type of book, from a selection of children's picture books to a sampling of cheap dime paperbacks. This room had it all. On the far wall sat a selection of magazines and comic books. Beside that were stacks of yellowed newspapers. What an interesting setup, I muttered, and my voice carried strangely through the room. My words broke a silence so thick I thought I might have been standing in an ancient Egyptian tomb, and I turned as if trying to catch my words and take them back so that I might not wake the sleeping texts. But alas, my words were out and lost to me forever. As I turned, I looked through the entrance to another room I hadn't seen before, and a paperback book spine leapt out at me as if highlighted. I stepped into that room and plucked the book from the shelf. It was one of my favorites from a long time back, George R. Stewart's Earth Abides. I held it in my hands like a trophy. I thumbed it open and sniffed at the wonderfully musty smell that can hardly be described so much as it is loved by a bibliophile. Then I flipped through to the middle of the book and I began reading, but not aloud. I dared not speak anything else for fear of ruining again that special silence. I read a passage that had stuck with me all these years. The main character, Ish, upon rebuilding a small civilization after the world had been ravaged by plague, takes the boy Joey to one of the libraries left over from before year one. Halfway through this scene, I noticed that certain words from the passage were missing, as if the ink from the page had dissolved. I flipped through to another passage. Sure enough, the same thing seemed to have happened there as well. I put the book down and picked up another one. Again, several passages throughout the text were blank. In some places, complete lines were missing. I tried another to find the same results, randomly scattered throughout. I paused and sniffed the air, as if I would be able to tell as if there were some sort of corrosive elements lurking in the room, slowly removing the ink from the pages. But I could detect nothing. Instead, I left the books there and moved on into the next room to my right. I selected another paperback and noticed that none of the words were missing from it. I replaced it and moved across the room, grabbing at what appeared to be an old sociology textbook. Strangely, whole pages and entire chapters were blank. I'd heard stories and read articles stating that the paper itself of some of the oldest books printed were apparently reacting with the air, causing them to disintegrate. I wondered if perhaps a similar thing was happening here, but to the ink rather than the paper. Such a thought sent shivers down my spine, through my being. The books in these rooms were not ancient by any means, and already the words were dissolving to nothing. A discovery like this might seem happenstance to the average person, or perhaps boring to one whose only source of information is the internet. But to a book lover like myself, it was as if God had stepped down from heaven and announced that the world would soon be ending. I spent the next 10 minutes or so rushing from room to room, picking up different types of books and thumbing through them, trying to discover some sort of pattern. But the dissolution of the words seemed completely random. It wasn't specific to any one room or any one kind of book. The phenomenon appeared without any detectable pattern. It then came upon me to try to find the book clerk and point my discovery out to him or her. Or perhaps the book clerk would already have known about this strange occurrence. Perhaps they would explain it to me as a result of the nearby industrial smelters filling the local atmosphere with a highly selective airborne corrosive material. Only by that point, I could not quite remember the way I had come. I began a path from room to room, hoping I'd recall having been in one of them. But in the same way that I was unable to detect a pattern in the phenomenon of the dissolving words, I was unable to recognize any of the rooms I passed through. I called out once, only to hear my voice echo through the room I was in and bounce out in the many available directions. But as before, when I spoke, I had the strange sensation that my voice would wake the sleeping tomes. Beginning to panic, I ran. From room to room I ran, first taking every exit to my immediate right, and then when that didn't help, every doorway to my left. Finally, I collapsed to the floor, out of breath and out of the energy to be panicked any longer. Looks like I might be trapped here for a long time, I told myself. I might as well take my time and map out my movement in the maze of books and rooms. Perhaps that would help me. I pulled a hardback text from the wall and flipped through it until I found a blank page. Digging into my breast pocket of my jacket, I plucked out my Mont Blanc pen, the one I always carried with me. Perhaps it was in case I was overcome with that once-in-a-lifetime inspiration that all aspiring writers dream will come. Perhaps it was a ritual of connecting myself with the writing instrument so that we were mates on this voyage of life. Whatever it was, I was glad to have made the effort my whole adult life to carry this pen with me. For that day, it just might be the thing that helped to get me out of this unusual dilemma. I began to scribble down the shape of the room I was standing in, leaving spaces to the front of myself, to my left, and directly behind me where the other rooms joined it. Then, my sketch of that room complete, I entered the room directly in front of me. A hollow groan boomed through the infinite silence. The groan steadily became a wail as I paused in the doorway, dropping both pen and book to clamp my hands to my ears. It echoed through my head, despite my efforts to keep it out, and seemed to swirl around the room, announcing its misery in no uncertain terms. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I turned on the spot, almost afraid to see what had caused that horrid sound. But there was nothing in the room behind me. Nothing, of course, but the books and the shelves that had always been there. There was no way I was going back into that room. Whatever caused that sound might be lurking around the corner. I considered my pen and the book. I dropped them just inside the room. I decided to abandon my plans of mapping out the place. I then wandered, almost casually, considering how startled I'd been, from room to room. Occasionally, I would stop to examine a book which caught my eye. I did this, according to my wristwatch, for about 3 hours. During this time, I discovered a couple more abnormalities. The first notable one was that a good deal of the books I examined lacked a copyright page. I wasn't sure whether to chalk this up to the same phenomenon that caused the ink to disappear, or if it was for some other reason. The second was that the physical layout of the rooms. I mentioned earlier that the shelves reached right up to the ceiling, but I believe I failed to note the differing heights of each room. Each room conformed to a slightly different shape and height, almost the way each snowflake is not exactly the same as the next, no matter how similar they at first appear. It was towards the end of this casual wandering when I was struck with a strange notion. I thought about all the books I'd seen that day, that I would love to have purchased. The only problem was that I couldn't find the cashier or the exit. How ironic to have such a wonderful choice of books and to be unable to purchase any. Not only that, but for the most part to discover, upon beginning to take the time to read the book, that it was not actually complete, that it was missing words, lines, complete pages. I wondered for a moment if I had died and was somehow in a kind of hell for book browsers. The ones who waltz into a store, browse for hours, even sit and read entire chapters, then leave, never once making a single purchase. I laughed at the irony of such a hell and then decided against it. Having worked at a bookstore for my first 4 years after graduating from college, I knew that if this were such a hell, not only would I not be alone here, but there would barely be room for us no matter how endless these rooms seemed. Still, it was an interesting premise to toss about in my mind while I tried to find my way out. Several such notions gnawed at me in the hours I wandered, before I was finally overcome with fatigue and had to sit. Not long after propping myself up against a bookshelf, I must have fallen asleep. There's a scene break here. I'm not sure how long after that I awoke, but when I did, it felt like no other waking I'd ever experienced. I could still sense the world around me, but I wasn't quite myself anymore. As best I can describe, I was nothing more than a room stacked with shelf upon shelf of all the books I had read in my life. I was added on to the maze of rooms in this bookshop and must have somehow been fused into it when I slept. I can't really say how this happened or who caused it. Perhaps this is part of a natural evolution which might have started with a single book that gained consciousness. With human-like consciousness came the fear of disintegration and the desire to multiply and grow. At least now, I understand a little of the weird phenomenon which I had discovered, for it occurs in the books which I house inside of me, inside of the special room which is me. I hold inside of me all the texts which I have read over the course of my life, and within those texts are certain words, passages, and entire pages which I either skipped over or which I accidentally missed while reading them. So it wasn't due to some strange chemical in the air, but rather from a reading habit that can occur in even the most fastidious reader. My consciousness is mostly taken up by the books within my spirit, and being stuck only with them, I'm sad that I had not read them more carefully while I'd had the chance. For I have perused them again countless times, and yes, I am disappointed for having accidentally or intentionally skipped certain parts, for I never will know the words I had missed out on. As time passes, though, I'm not sure how much has. I'm slowly learning how to extend my consciousness out into the neighboring rooms and peruse any of the same texts that my silent companions have read that I might house, hoping to fill the gaps of my own books. It takes what seems like eternity and quite a bit of concentrated effort, but it can be done. After all, it's not like I don't have the time, but I am leery of a time when that too will not be enough. What we need is more. We need more things to read and share with each other, and we wait for that day when one will join us who has read all the same books we have, but who has also read all the words, so we might be enlightened completely. We have nothing but time, so we wait. But soft. I think I hear the entrance bell tinkling. Could it be? Yes. Yes, I think it is. After all this time of browsing through countless bookstores, you have found your rightful resting place. Nice of you to come. Browse to your heart's content. We've been waiting a long time for you to join us. So that was Browsers. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the story, Browsers was based on my very first trip to Hamilton, Ontario. And I had set about to go and see if I could visit as many of the bookstores as possible. It's kind of a thing that book nerds like me do. So I got out the yellow pages because this was pre-internet days when this happened, and I wrote down all these different addresses. I got out a map, a printed map, and set out to explore this strange city because I had the entire day to myself. And I found this shop in somewhere in downtown Hamilton. And I went into the shop, and it was like that. There was these weird rooms, and they seemed like they were in the process of being constructed as we went. And I don't even remember seeing a front desk. It almost was this weird, bizarre room. And I was probably lost for about half an hour. I couldn't actually find my way back. And that's when the idea came to me. What if there was a bookstore that was like a Venus flytrap to book nerds like me, and it sucks you in and it absorbs you into the bookstore? And of course, I couldn't resist one of my favorite novels of all time, Earth Abides. I couldn't resist a quote that has to do with a library. The first time this young boy who comes in this new society and has never seen a library before, how he is overwhelmed with that. And so that was Browsers, and Browsers appears in the short story collection Active Reader, which is available in print and audiobook and paperback, and you can even check it out at your local library. There's two other stories in there. Active Reader, which is a story about, it's a cautionary tale about loyalty bookstore programs and what people might do if they could track what books you were reading. And Distractions, which is a dark humor tale of a writer who is very, very frustrated that he's being distracted and can't get his writing done. It's not based on reality in any way, shape, or form. Several of those stories also appeared originally in my very first book, One Hand Screaming, which was published in 2004. So again, this is Mark Leslie. This has been Browsers, which was, I guess it was, what was I calling this? I was calling this Sunday night Shivers, I guess, because it's Sunday night. I hope you enjoyed that tale, and I hope you have some great stories and books to read. Just make sure, unlike my narrator, that you read every word and every page and don't skip anything, because look what can happen. Thanks very much for listening. Take care.